Hello and welcome back to the Milu Project. Today we'll be looking at the languages of Colombia. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe and join us on our linguistic pilgrimage around the world. Anyway, let's begin. Now you probably already know that in Colombia people speak Spanish. But this Spanish isn't exactly the same as standard Castilian Spanish spoken in Spain. So what makes this dialect of Spanish different? Well, first, let's look at the phonology. These are some of the sound changes which Colombian Spanish has undergone. The most distinctive probably being the removal of these sounds, and the merger of these sounds, which is commonly known as ceseo, is quite a noticeable sound change. Now, let's look at pronouns. Colombian Spanish uses something called voseo, which means that it uses the pronoun vos, where tu usually is. Although, this is technically banned in schools, as it's considered informal. But apart from schools and some other formal situations, the use of tu is quite limited. However, this distinction is actually of little importance, due to the fact that the pronoun usted is more commonly used than either of the two. Now, let's look at the Guayunaiki or Guajiro language. Well, Guajiro is an Arawakan language spoken in northern Colombia as well as neighbouring Venezuela, and it's the mother tongue of around 400,000 people. These are the vowels, which seem quite regular, and here are the consonants. As you can see, there are no voiced plosives, which might at first glance seem quite peculiar, but this is actually very common for languages in Guajiro's vicinity. It's also worth mentioning that the IPA chart is a representation of actual sounds people make, instead of how they think of them. In this case, the speakers of the language don't draw a distinction between voiced and voiceless variations of these sounds. Here are Guajiro's pronouns, which actually seem very regular, which I like. And here is a sample sentence. It's quite easy to see how much a language marks gender, although this isn't really grammatical gender. And here you can see, well, another sentence showcasing the language. Guajiro is quite polysynthetic in typology, and despite having a rich verbal morphology, it doesn't really do the same for its nouns, because so much information is already encoded into a single verb. Guajiro also likes to distinguish between alien and inalienable possession, and uses things called classifiers to denote the semantic relationships between words. Now, for the remainder of the video, we're going to be looking at the Palenque Creole, which is a Spanish-based Creole spoken in Palenque, a village in northern Colombia. But to understand the history of the language, we first need to understand its speakers and how they got there. Well, the community of Palenque was established in the 17th century by enslaved people who had escaped the Spanish, most of whom came from Central Africa and were speakers of the Kikongo language. One of these enslaved people was a prince named Bencos Bioho, and along with 10 other Africans and Native Americans, helped establish the community. Now, the community was very successful in defending their town, due to both the skill of the inhabitants and the rugged landscape. However, the attacks from the Spanish became increasingly deadly and violent. Seeing their success, the King of Spain offered to stop the attacks with the understanding that Palenque could no longer accept more enslaved people. This led to centuries of isolation from the outside world, which caused the formation of a creole. So let's have a look at this language. Well, like many creoles, it lacks inflection, gender, and conjugation, and so it relies on pronouns and tense suffixes, like these. There is a present, habitual, future, past, and imperfect, most of which have their origins in Spanish auxiliary verbs. Here's an example of a question in Palenquero. The language also uses the plural marker ma, which is not only used for pluralizing nouns, but also marks cardinality below 3, after which it's not required, like in this example. Here's another sentence which demonstrates the fact that articles are absent from the creole. And interestingly, the language actually has 4 copulars, or linking words, which are used in these different contexts. Here's an example of a sentence with Here's an example with ta, and here is an example of how senda is used. These are the pronouns which Palenquero uses, most of which are derived from Spanish, but a few are Kikongo in origin. I would recommend looking more into this language, as it's one of the only Spanish-based creoles in South America, and would be good inspiration for a conlang. Anyway, since you watched to the end, here's an example of a longer text, so you can get a bit more of a taste of the language. Anyway, that's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next time in 2 weeks for our episode on the languages of Brazil. Bye!